Next up is Kiera VACLAVIK, PhD, who's a professor of children's literature and childhood culture at Queen Mary University of London. Her research centers on children's literature and childhood culture from the mid-19th century to the present day, with a focus on Victorian works and their afterlives. Her project exploring the Alice books in relation to fashion led to a fabric collection with Liberty London, an exhibition she curated in 2015 at the V&A Museum of Childhood called The Alice Look, and the monograph Fashioning Alice, the Career of Lewis Carroll's Icon 1860 to 1901. So please welcome Kiera VACLAVIK to continue our program. Welcome, Kiera.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Hugh, and thank you very much to Linda and all her team for brilliant organisation of this event, and also for having me yet again. Thank you also to all of the members of the audience for being here, especially on a Saturday. It turns out there's actually quite a lot to say about ballet shoes and about hair ribbons, so I shall dive straight in. First performed and produced for a female audience in the shape of the Liddell sisters, the Alice books were initially an all-male production. But Alice was rapidly taken up by a whole range of creative women, from artist E.G. Thompson, who provided the cover art for Carroll's 1895 auto adaptation, The Nursery Alice, and American illustrator Blanche McManus, to director Eva Le Gallienne, artists such as Leonora Carrington and Eileen Agard, and writers including Joyce Carol Oates. Spanning multiple forms and ranging from fleeting allusions to more pervasive, sustained reworkings, the roll call of women rethinking, referencing, and responding to the Alice books is long and illustrious. The multi-talented performer turned author Noel Streatfeild and her sister illustrator Ruth Jervis also take their place in this list because of this book. Ballet Shoes, a story of three children on the stage from 1936 with illustrations by Jervis. And what you're looking at here are first editions from the UK on the left and from the US in the following year on the right. Now these first editions might not look much, particularly the British one, but there was a silver dust wrapper for this book made of a very thin silver paper, a bit like apparently that of a chocolate wrapper, which means that surviving copies of this British first edition are incredibly rare. Now in this book, within its covers and silver wrapped covers, the eldest of the three Fossil sisters takes her first professional step on the road to stardom, playing the part of, guess who, Alice, in a London stage production in the all-important, for us, centenary year of 1932. It's a really important episode, essential to understanding key themes and preoccupations within the novel, as well as offering insight into the reception of Carroll's work in the all-important decade of the 1930s. But the relationship between the Alice books and Ballet Shoes, activated by this specific episode, goes well beyond it, enabling insights, I hope, into key themes in both works to do with girlhood in relation to things like physical appearance, performance, gender norms, sisterly relations, and quite a lot more. I'm going to be looking in a lot of detail at the specific Alice episode in Ballet Shoes, before then moving on to those wider themes. But I want to begin with some background material on Streatfeild herself. So who was Noel Streatfeild? She was a writer who became especially well known for her children's works, to the extent of being referred to by one critic as, quote, a national monument. But before that, she wrote adult novels. And before that, she had a 10-year-long career as an actress after training at RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. And what you're looking at here is a very, I think, striking image of Streatfeild by Roger Hill, taken to mark her 70th birthday, in which she's positioned in front of another very striking image of her, a painting by Louis Baumer from 1926, which is in the National Portrait Gallery. As an actress in the 1920s, using the stage name Noel Sonning, she performed both modern works and Shakespeare, touring the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Here she is in Midsummer Night's Dream. And these two images, so this is her acting career in the 20s, and then we're fast forwarding now in this wonderful image, another one from the National Portrait Gallery. This is 1936, the year of publication of Ballet Shoes, and another one, obviously it must have been the same shoot. I think these are by Bassano, and again are in the National Portrait Gallery. Streatfeild's life and work share a number of affinities with Carroll, and not just that nobody knows how to spell their names properly or pronounce them. Like Carroll, she was the child of an eminent member of the Anglican Church. Her father, who's right over on the right here, became the Bishop of Lewis in 1928, just before his death. And you can see Noel is the furthest child to the right here, with her hand placed quite jauntily on her hip. So her father was a member of the Anglican Church, and like Carroll, she was also, as you can see here, one of several siblings. Growing up, Noel experienced a physical landscape regularly frequented by Carroll. After living in St Leonard's, which was also known to Carroll, the Streatfeild family moved to Eastbourne in 1911, where, as you all know, Carroll had spent his summers for the best part of 30 years. Similarities between the two writers extend well beyond this shared physical landscape. Neither married, and both were fascinated by and highly knowledgeable about the world of theatre. Both were multifaceted, with a number of strings to their respective bows. In their professional careers, they demonstrated a similar awareness of the commercial possibilities of their work and flair for exploiting it. Remember that silver dust wrapper. Excuse me. And they both returned to early successes in all manner of sequels, new editions, extensions, and merchandise. Both, fairly unusually, are auto-adapters who rewrote an existing work for a younger readership. Carroll's rewriting of Wonderland in the Nursery Alice that I've already mentioned, and Streatfeild's adaptation of her first novel for adults, called The Witch Arts, was the book that became Ballet Shoes in 1936. Like so many members of her generation, Streatfeild had a deep personal knowledge of the Alice books. And she didn't really read them, but experienced and used them. Alice in Wonderland was one of only a very small number of professional stage productions that she saw when she was growing up. And she also cut her teeth as a performer in a school production of Wonderland, winning a solo role as the Mock Turtle in Eastbourne in 1912, so she would have been 16. On becoming a writer in the late 20s, early 30s, the relationship with Carroll's work continued. In a key scene in her fourth novel, Shepherdess of Sheep from 1934, the heroine compares her first encounter with the child for whom she will sacrifice herself and then euthanize in a fairly mad episode. She compares this encounter with the baby to that of Alice with the Duchess's writhing pig baby. Streatfeild was by no means enthralled to Carroll's work or uncritical of them. Her biographer, Angela Bull, cites a 1937 talk to the London Writers' Circle in which Streatfeild recalled the dissatisfaction which tinged her love of the Alice books. That's Angela Bull's way of talking about this. Streatfeild said this: "I remember thinking as a small child that if Alice did not go to sleep, we should hear more about her home." While lots of readers have expressed dissatisfaction with Alice's awakening at the end of the book, few have come at it from this end. I think this terre-à-terre approach, the desire to dwell in the domestic detail, while simultaneously being drawn to a work of fantastical nonsense, is very much in line with Streatfeild's own description of Ballet Shoes as a fairy story with its feet halfway on the ground. So what is Ballet Shoes about exactly? Ballet Shoes, a story of three children on the stage, to give it its full title, is the story of fossil sisters Pauline, Petrova and Posy. The three children received stage training so as to eventually earn money to boost the household finances imperiled by the prolonged absence of their adopted great uncle. The novel follows their training and first performances, experienced quite differently by the three contrasting characters. We've got blonde actress Pauline, the brunette mechanic pilot Petrova, and finally red-headed dancer Posy. It's worth pointing out that it's really not about ballet at all. The subtitle, A Story of Three Children on the Stage, is in fact a lot more accurate. Now, after various financial and personal struggles, the Fossil sisters are eventually rewarded for their efforts with stardom, success, and the possibility of following their natural inclinations. Pauline's first step on the path to becoming a celebrated actress is, crucially for us, landing the role at age 12 of Alice. And we know that this is in 1932 because of this document, which is intercalated into the text. And this is Pauline's application for a stage license. And if you look down right to the bottom where my finger is on that image, you can see that it's dated November the 30th, 1932. Before looking in detail at that episode, it's worth saying, I think, a word or two about the overarching similarities and differences between Ballet Shoes and the Alice books. In terms of their status, both are classics remaining constantly in print. Multiple editions of both titles are available in bookshops, at least in the UK today. I know that because I checked. Both obviously, obvious in terms of Alice at least, have been widely translated and re-illustrated and have been adapted across a wide range of media on the page, stage and screen. And although it was a bit of a Harry Potter style runaway success on publication, Ballet Shoes that is, there were queues around the block, there were special sections of bookshops devoted to it, there were limitations on the number of copies you could buy, even Streatfeild herself could only get 2 copies. Despite all of that, despite it being this kind of huge blockbuster at the time, Ballet Shoes today is obviously nowhere near in the same ranks as Alice in Wonderland. Maybe, just maybe, if Disney had done a Ballet Shoes, all of this might have been different. But as it is, and despite the significant push given by its featuring in Nora Ephron's 1998 You've Got Mail, neither the book, the characters, or the author are household names in the way that Alice and Carol are. In You've Got Mail, a screenshot from which you're looking at right now, it's a woman who asks for the books for her daughter, and it's a woman bookseller, played by Meg Ryan, who sings their praises. And like the Alice books, Ballet Shoes is also often deemed to be for girls and marketed as such. This is because, of course, both the Alice books and Ballet Shoes feature female protagonists. And these female protagonists are, in all cases, highly resilient with a clear sense of what they want. And I'll come back to those sort of more precise similarities later. Just a final sort of overarching point is to say that for those of you who don't know Ballet Shoes, one of the main differences with the Alice books is that Ballet Shoes, although it does have fantasy fairy tale elements, you know, it's a fairy story with its feet halfway on the ground, it takes place entirely within a recognizable real world setting, this of a world of stage licenses and references to real London landmarks, roads, railways, and so on. And it also refers to events almost contemporaneous to the date of publication, including the death of King George VI. So having looked in sort of a general way at the authors and the overarching text, I want to now have a look in more detail at the Alice episode, in Ballet Shoes, which this episode, with all, if you take into account sort of the whole thing from right at the beginning to the end, it runs across 3 chapters right in the center of the book. And it begins when Pauline is called for her first professional audition, provoking a financial crisis because she hasn't got anything suitable to wear. Now, this might sound slightly ridiculous, maybe a bit excessive, a bit frothy and superficial, but it's actually based on a very sound understanding of how things work. And the concerted response to get her something decent to wear, and that decent thing is the black dress that you can see here, Pauline is the one on the left, is shown to be absolutely essential. And the family are totally justified in taking this seriously. Pauline knows that she's going to audition for Alice on the strength of the hair ribbons she's asked to provide. And I'm going to be coming back to those hair ribbons later. So she knows she's going to be auditioning for Alice, and she's naturally drawn to this role. Streatfeild tells us that with shining eyes, she's excited by the prospect of, quote, meeting all the people, end quote, of Carroll's world. It should also be said that, you know, that it's the earning power also which really kind of draws her to this part. But in the detailed account of the audition, where she sings, dances, and does a speech, it's made clear that it's neither her interest in the part nor her abilities which get her the lead role. Pauline is very competent, but not the most proficient. She's outdanced and outacted by fellow pupil Winifred, who you can see here on the right. Rather, Pauline gets the part because she looks the part. I'll come back to what this means in a moment. We don't actually know, there's a whole chapter sort of about the production, but we don't really find out very much about it. We know that there's a Mad Hatter and that there are adult actors. We know that her costume is made by the theatre wardrobe department. It's not shop bought, nor is it made by a big external costume department. So although there's a speech and a song and dance in the audition, this is an acting role that Pauline wins, and it's a sort of acting production rather than being sort of a dancing part. She's acting here, she's not dancing. So that's about all we know about what happens on stage in the production. What Streatfeild really focuses on, what she's interested in a chapter entitled Pauline Learns a Lesson, is the effect of playing this part on Pauline's character. The combination of proficiency and physical appearance is a winning formula for Pauline. She's a very good Alice. She eventually plays her 2 years in a row, and she does a subsequent radio adaptation. This success soon goes to her head. Pauline becomes conceited, rude, and bossy, culminating in a very un-Alice-like temper tantrum aimed at the theatre manager himself. But after a very kind of slow and long build-up, the punishment for her, quote, atrocious behaviour is swift. Pauline forfeits her right to the part, and her long-suffering understudy, Winifred, again here on the right, takes over. Pauline is quickly contrite and her role returned, but not before the stage manager makes it clear to her that she's merely a cog in a much larger Carrollian theatrical machine. He tells her, it was an object lesson she might remember always, but nobody was irreplaceable. Pauline looked puzzled, that's much more Alice-like, I think, as she did not know the word. So he explained that it meant that you could always get somebody else to act any part, that the play was the thing. Alice was just as much Alice, whether Winifred was acting her or Pauline. Lewis Carroll's words were what mattered. Then he told her to run along. Now, Pauline swallows this, but her younger sister, ballet dancer Posy, refers to take the yoke which Pauline so readily accepts. For her, When I dance, she said, nobody else will do instead of me. They'll come to see me, and if I'm not there, they'll just go home. And it's on this very interesting note that the whole Alice episode ends. So what does this episode reflect and reveal? Well, in some ways, it confirms what we already know about Alice productions in this period. From the point of view of understanding Ballet Shoes, I guess what it does is contribute significantly to the text's realism. In the 1930s, Alice was a popular choice for productions right around the world, with perhaps the best known being that of Eva Le Gallienne on Broadway in 1932. In London alone, there was an Alice every year except 1931, and actresses such as Ursula Henry returned repeatedly to the role, 3 times in her case. The 12-year-old Pauline Fossil to make her professional debut as Alice was then entirely plausible. And the multiplicity of actresses playing the part from the 1880s onwards means that Streatfeild's choice of Alice to deliver this particular message about expendability is really apt. Tens, if not hundreds, of little girls and young women had performed this role by this time. The whole account demonstrates what we might suspect given Streatfeild's background as an actress. That's to say, her familiarity with the theatre and with coverage of it. Pauline's attraction to the role chimes with the profuse declarations of pleasure regarding it made by countless actresses, and with casting decisions and a general approach to staging. Like Pauline, 13-year-old Beryl Laverick, who starred in the big London 1932 production at the Little Theatre, was, according to the Daily Mail, chosen, quote, chosen largely because she was considered to resemble more closely than other applicants Tenniel's drawing of Alice. This draws attention to 2 key aspects of the Alice episode in Ballet Shoes. The importance of appearances, firstly, and the approach to staging classic works. We're going to look at each of these in turn now. So when getting ready for the audition, by having the ribbons which make it clear to everyone which play is being undertaken, Pauline's teacher exclaims that she looks, quote, ridiculously Tenniel. By the 1930s, a clear consensus has emerged about Alice's appearance. She's blonde, she's pretty, and she wears a hairband or hair ribbons. In an article entirely devoted to Carroll and Alice's hair, yes, I have done that, I've shown how it was in the 1930s that the first real Alice-based fashion trend happened. Launched by Lady Abdy, socialite Lady Abdy, Alice bands were worn by the great and the good of the fashion world and took the entire world by storm. By 1938, tying a ribbon around your head was enough to become Alice. In Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, Maxim de Winter instructs his young wife to, quote, put a ribbon around your hair and be Alice in Wonderland. This is to the what turns out to be the doomed fancy dress ball that she's planning, and she really ought to have taken his advice. She would have saved herself a lot of grief. So that's the hairband. In terms of the prettiness, I think this is something which is worth dwelling on. Instead of Winifred over here on the right, with her, quote, clever, interesting face and long but rather colourless brown hair, end quote, the role goes to conventionally attractive, quote, golden-haired, pink and white Pauline. Golden-haired, pink and white Pauline. So accustomed have we become to this aspect of her portrayal that I think it's important to remember that there's no reason at all that Alice should be attractive. And indeed, Winifred can successfully play the part. Alice's looks are rarely mentioned within Carroll's original text, and when they are, it's in disparaging comments by other characters. Perhaps a sort of topsy-turvy logic implies the reverse here. Certainly Tenniel's images, which are the sole direct source of her appearance, seem always to have been interpreted as conveying attractiveness. Carroll himself frequently comments upon the prettiness of actresses playing the part, and it was a feature of stage reviews from the outset. To give one of countless examples, there's a review from 1888 which says, Alice was, just as you would suppose, a pretty little girl in a white frock with long hair hanging down her back. In her accompanying image of Pauline as Alice, which you can see here on the right, illustrator Ruth Jervis adheres closely to Tenniel's original conception of the heroine, right down to the band decorations along the hem of the dress's full skirt and the pinafore's pocket. She tames the wildness of the hair, adds the much mentioned hair ribbon, which Alice only acquires in the Looking Glass illustrations, and not only rectifies Tenniel's wayward proportions, but kind of quite significantly reduces Pauline Alice's waistline, rendering what we get therefore is a kind of longer, leaner character. Now, Jervis may well have taken inspiration from or just drawn directly on those 1932 costumes. It's more than possible or probable, I think. But certainly what we can say is that with Jervis's 1936 image here, we're very clearly on the way to Disney's 1951 Alice. Just a final point on this illustration by Jervis. The positioning of her alongside the Hatter here emphasizes her extreme petiteness. With the exception of the Queen of Hearts, no one towers over Alice to this extent in Tenniel's illustrations. So Jervis sort of gives us a character who looks in this image much more like a 7-year-old than the 12-year-old that Pauline actually is. She presents Pauline as Alice as small then and perfectly formed. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say about this episode. The second is about approaches to performance and to adaptation. And while in the last session we heard a lot about liberties, this is kind of the exact opposite. Now we're on to fidelities. So just to recap, Pauline is told in no uncertain terms that, quote, the play was the thing. Alice was just as much Alice, whether Winifred was acting her or Pauline. Lewis Carroll's words were what mattered. Now, earlier in Ballet Shoes, the texts are informed by their dancing and acting teachers that, quote, an author wrote down what he or she wanted said, and no actor, amateur or professional, had a right to alter the words in any way whatsoever. Very categoric. Now, such deference and fidelity certainly characterize the multiple stage versions of the Alice books in the 1930s. Will Brooker, in an article on the centenary year, has pulled together a range of examples demonstrating this. So, for example, in the 1932 production with Beryl Laverick, somebody says, the producer has made every effort to keep as faithfully as possible to the spirit of Lewis Carroll's Wonderland. No extraneous matter has been introduced. And from another production the same year, this time an amateur one, here there is a stress that, quote, every care is being taken to keep as closely as possible to the book. And Lewis Carroll's language is used throughout. So again, what we have here then is sort of a whole thing about plausibility and realism in Ballet Shoes. It confirms how adaptations were being undertaken in the 30s. And I think, you know, that in itself might not necessarily be kind of huge news, but I suppose it's just worth sort of reflecting on that compared to the ways in which we now approach adaptation. It's a kind of a massive step change in how, not just for Alice, but for all kinds of adaptation. It's a very, very different kind of way of going about things. But what's really interesting about this, I think, for me, is Streatfeild's own kind of take on this particular approach to adaptation. She can't quite let it go. She both signs up to this vision and distances herself from it. Pauline accepts her expendability, suggesting that it's the male stage directors and authors and illustrators who have the power over their female creations and vessels. They're really kind of subservient in this sort of approach. But as we've seen, Posey rejects it entirely. She's having none of this at all. And her rejection of this kind of vision of the kind of monolithic kind of masculine power and control is also given credibility by Streatfeild. And I think that this is a really interesting sort of moment for Streatfeild, in the sense that she's moving from having been a performer to becoming an author. And so it's perhaps understandable that she leaves the sort of the range of possibilities here open. She's straddling both worlds, and so she wants to kind of keep a foot in both, so she both gets the kind of need to obey, but also perhaps the desire to assert her own authority as an author. Okay, in the final part of my talk, I want to move beyond this specific episode and think again about the broader relationship between Ballet Shoes and the Alice books, and about what light the comparison sheds on Carroll's work and the avenues it opens up to what was really nicely referred to as the Carrollian universe in the promotional materials for this event. So we can see Alice as a literary forebear to the Fossil sisters, or if we come at it from the other angle, to see the fossils as a sort of disaggregated Alice. Comparison between Alice and the fossils confirms, I think, certain aspects of Alice's character that are widely recognized, but also I think draws attention to certain features which tend to be more overlooked. Firstly, all of these girls have been brought up to be well-mannered and well-behaved, polite and genteel. The fossil sisters face acute money problems, but they're not impoverished Winifred any more than Alice is uneducated Mabel in her poky, toyless house. All of them are active, spirited, energetic girls who know what they want and successfully go after it, whether that's getting to a garden, becoming a queen, or being taken into a ballet company. Time and time again, they surmount the various obstacles encountered. Now, it obviously follows from this that both Alice and the Fossil sisters, especially Petrova, challenge gender norms and expectations. All three Fossil sisters want more than the dolls' houses of the South Kensington Museum, to which they're taken all the time on rainy days. And Petrova, although good at performing femininity in some of the roles that she has to play, embraces both conventionally masculine modes of dress and pursuits. She's into mechanics, flight, and exploration. For her part, Alice sets off on quests hitherto a largely male prerogative. And when thinking about the dolls' houses, I always think about her getting stuck so memorably in the White Rabbit's house. And her appearance is also a lot more gender neutral than it may now seem to us. Boys of Alice's age were widely dressed in the kind of outfit she's shown wearing in Wonderland. This is an image of a boy from 1865. He's a naughty boy, but not. It's not like he's being punished for his naughtiness with having to wear clothes like this. This is just what boys of this age wore at this time. Similarly, long, loose hair also became very popular for younger boys in the wake of the Fauntleroy craze of the 1880s. So I've kind of made these sorts of points in the past, but the things that seem a little bit newer to me are another two different points. First of all, that Alice too is a performer, albeit a domestic rather than professional one. And this is an aspect of her character which I don't think is sort of looked at that much, but which Carroll is at particular pains to underline. And I say that because it's mentioned in the opening chapters of both of the books, and I think that kind of dual positioning is really significant. In Wonderland, we learn just that quote, "This curious child was very fond of pretending to be two people." But in Through the Looking Glass, we discover that "let's pretend" is in fact her favourite phrase, put into action eclectically and imaginatively. She comes up with the rather mad and perhaps slightly sinister suggestion that her nurse plays the bone to her hungry hyena. And she unsuccessfully suggests the more conventional kings and queens to her exasperatingly literal-minded sister. And this brings us to the second and my final main point. Alice too has a sister and is a sister. In Ballet Shoes, the protagonists are clearly demarcated individuals with their standard physical differences tied to different interests and destinies, but it's impossible to ever forget that they are sisters. Similarly, Ruth Jervis's, remember Streatfeild's own sister, the sisters everywhere in this, shows the fossils both individually and in 5 images together. Despite various frictions and disagreements, the fossils demonstrate a strong sense of mutual understanding and loyalty, closing ranks instinctively and, they know, quite unfairly against Winifred when Pauline suffers. They give up precious items and even more precious dreams for each other. Perhaps precisely because each is granted a distinct niche, there's a complete absence of the rivalry which so often characterizes both real-life sisterly relations and literary representations of sisters. Streatfeild emphasizes shared experience and collaboration in order to achieve individual dreams. In the Alice books, on the other hand, especially in the main part of the narrative, it's easy to forget Alice has a sister, or in fact any family at all. Alice's nameless sister occupies the margins of Wonderland's frame narrative and is further downgraded in Looking Glass, where she's replaced as interlocutor by a, in his instance, named black kitten. Now, it's clearly a less prominent relationship than in Ballet Shoes, but how does the nature of the relationship compare? And that seemingly simple question is actually a really difficult one to answer. On the one hand, with Alice and her sister, there is affection, care, and complicity in the exchanges between them. The head on the lap, gentle brushing away of dead leaves, patient attendance to the recounting of the dream, a bit like listening to people's holiday stories maybe, and that affectionate kiss. Perhaps by sending her in to her tea, she's preserving Alice from the dull reality of her dream experience, of the reality of her dream experiences. On the other hand, the sisters are clearly set up as clashing. Not only are their literary tastes quickly established as being contrasting, we also learn in the second book that while Alice has an open and easy attitude towards play, her sister is literal-minded and exact, refusing to countenance being more than one person at once. Is this because she's older, maybe, or is she kind of just temperamentally different? That desire to connect one thing to another and know more that is in Looking Glass is also apparent at the end of Wonderland, where she matches up object with object, voice with voice, animal with animal, sound with sound. The elder sister, very much in control, can be seen as an authoritative exegete, filling in the narrative gaps and revealing, like a detective in the murder mystery genre in its infancy at this point, who or what done it. Yet it's perhaps she who is the pedantic criminal, murdering to dissect, not preserving Alice so much as deflating and puncturing the wonder of her dreams. Certainly for many readers, Alice's sister compounds this crime with her projection into the future, as opposed to the fossils whose future is envisaged in uniquely professional terms, what they will do rather than with whom they'll be. And with the world literally at their feet, Alice is surrounded by children with no indication that she's anywhere other than where she began. The dream gives way to reality, with many critics and readers expressing a sense of dissatisfaction or even betrayal that the radical potential of an independent, assertive, adventuring Alice should be reduced and tidied away to a time to tame an anticlimactic vision of compliance and domesticity. But perhaps through the lens of Ballet Shoes, with its stress on professions and on creativity, there's a different reading of the sister and her vision. If we look closely, we see that space is made for the creativity and imagination showcased by Alice's dream. In the compelling, strange tales she will share with the other little children gathered about her, none of whom, it's worth pointing out, are necessarily her own. Her ability to empathize and participate in the emotions and experiences of her juvenile audience is also made clear. Maybe then, Alice's future is something more than domestic drudgery, something quite different to maternal misfortune. Perhaps the empathetic, imaginative future Alice is not a mother, but, like Streatfeild, a professional writer. To be honest, I'm not sure how convinced I am by this reading. What I do know, though, is that our interpretation of the relationship between the sisters and Alice's sister's vision of the future is heavily shaped by illustrators. As we saw in Arnold Hershen's wonderful talk yesterday, many illustrators have followed Carroll rather than tenure in featuring Alice's sister at the beginning and or ending of the work. And to those wonderful images shown yesterday, I'll just add this spoiler Danish cover of 1875, where Alice is already asleep, even on the cover. So everybody, you know, there's no big reveal at the end at all. And then also I'll just add this lovely Marie Laurencin image, which is, I'm adding just because it's lovely, but also because it's from 1930. So the kind of right period for what we're talking about. Now, all of these images featuring Alice's sister do really important work in cueing and shaping our response to that character through, for instance, the extent to which she and Alice are shown to be physically similar and in physical proximity to each other. While some illustrators emphasize intimacy and affection, as here, others evoke disjunction and separation. This is Graham Baker, somebody's got his name, illustration from last year, which I think conveys that sense of sort of separation with that fence post right in the middle there between the two characters. Others are just very strange. This is an unknown edition from 1962. So these are images which often need to be read in pairs, looking at the beginning and the ending. And I have to say, for me, it's really kind of work in progress. I've only really started to see this as a way into this question. So I'm afraid I don't have anything particularly definitive to conclude on this particular point. And it's really on this point of new avenues and further work to do that I'll wrap up today. In terms of Streatfeild and Ballet Shoes, I'd say that overall what's most interesting and striking, what I particularly like about it, is how she uses the Carrollian universe to her own ends. There's no subservience or deference on her part. Jervis, her sister, stays close to tenure and to the costumes based on tenure, but even she leaves her own distinctive stamp on the character, melding modernity and tradition in a way that, as we've seen, anticipates the Disney animation of 1951. As I've said, I'm not sure how convincing it is to try to recuperate Alice's sister and Alice's destiny. I have a sneaking suspicion that the ending of Alice is just not as satisfactory as that of Ballet Shoes, but I think that's okay. There's a lot more to the Alice books than their endings, obviously. Work on this paper has made me realise how much more there is to do on the specifically female interventions in the Carrollian universe. That's one thing. On ballet and dance, on motion in relation to the books within them, and then how dance is present in stage adaptations and eventually ballet only versions. That is, I think, a story which is yet to be told. Finally, the sister question is, I think, one ripe for exploration. How have illustrators portrayed Alice and her sister over time and in different cultural contexts? And what of adaptation in other media? Bringing all of these threads together, we might ask finally, how often does Alice's sister get the chance to wear ballet shoes? So on that note, I shall say a big thank you to everybody, and I think there might still be time for questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Kiera. So folks, any questions? There's been a lot of chat, particularly around hairbands.
Oh, Graham Baker-Smith. Thank you, Mark. Yeah.
I would.
Oh, go ahead, Dieter.
Good evening. Thank you for an interesting discussion. And given how big Alice's afterlives are, with adaptations and continuations and sequels and so forth, it must be exhaustive, but it must be a fascinating study, and to explore Alice's relationships to other children's books. But I just have one or two questions out of curiosity. Besides Alice, what would you say, what other English children's book has had the biggest impact on culture, or which has manifested itself in afterlives? Because I knew when I was at university, I had there was one student, she had done also a study on Alice and her afterlife, and she did, I think, her master's or a PhD on Peter Pan's afterlives afterwards. So what would you say, besides Alice, is the children's book that has had the most afterlives or the biggest impact?
Yeah, I was going to say Peter Pan. That was the one that immediately sprang to mind. I mean, I suppose I wanted to mention Lyra and his Dark Materials, actually, in terms of sort of this kind of genealogy of powerful female characters. So if we go from kind of Alice to the fossils, and then to a character, so his Dark Materials and Lyra, there have already been lots of adaptations, but obviously this is much more recent. But I suppose that's the kind of work which has really achieved a huge amount of kind of status, and it's the one that has sort of received the recognition of the sort of adult literary world as well. So I guess that will be one to watch, and obviously the Harry Potter books as well, I mean, in terms of impact. And then Afterlives, yeah, Jan has mentioned Little Women. That's a really good example, not British, of course. But yeah, I think those are probably... Yeah.
Maybe to a lesser extent, what would you say of Winnie the Pooh or The Wind in the Willows? Maybe they're still published today and still very much loved.
Yeah, absolutely. But and maybe also, I mean, Mary Poppins, from a similar period to Ballet Shoes, Mary Poppins, and I mean, it does kind of, when you mention Winnie the Pooh and Peter Pan, Wind in the Willows is obviously different, but the sort of Disney effect is very clear, isn't it, with all of those?
And would you say, I think there are many children's books, even at that time, that, you know, subconsciously channeled Alice. When you talk about, when I refer to Wind in the Willows, you know, talking animals, clothing, and Beatrix Potter, I think, was also influenced by Alice, and also perhaps The Secret Garden, Frances Hutchinson Burnett, this independent, strong mind child who finds the secret doorway, and in a way that garden, the function of the garden that Alice played. But last night we had this discussion. I'm not sure who started the discussion. And although it's American, we were discussing about whether L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, if he also channeled Alice into his writing. But like I said, he's American. So Alice's impact on American children's books could be quite another study on its own.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, definitely still a huge amount of work to do on Alice's specifically American afterlife, definitely. And then, yeah, I mean, just on that point about the sort of, the thing with the Alice books is that the very obvious adaptations, there's already so many of those that could take up a whole team of researchers' work for an entire lifetime. But then there's the kind of less obvious things, as you just mentioned, and they can be just as sort of, and it often more worthwhile to examine. And I hope sort of what looking at Ballet Shoes in this way sort of shows is that, you know, it's not only the kind of full massive reworkings, but also there's lots of works like this, and there are many more that sort of merit this attention and close probing about not just the sort of specific allusions and references, but how that then changes the way that we might look. Also, what's important about this is how it changes the way that we see the Alice books in the first place. So, you know, the Guinness advertising makes us notice more, doesn't it, the food and drink in the Alice books. So all of these adaptations and allusions and references work in both, you know, it shapes the way that we understand both the later works and the originals.
Yes, and Alice's relationship to other types of literary forms would be, I suppose, another daunting but fascinating study, because after Alice, I read somewhere that travel books, especially in foreign countries, often referred to it as a new Wonderland, or they referred it as to a Wonderland exploring this new country. And I think maybe Agatha Christie, who wrote detective fiction, she references Alice quite a lot. She wrote an autobiography which quotes a line from the White Knight song called "Come Tell Me How You Live," and even in her work she often quotes Alice. So how Alice has impacted other genres, like when I mentioned Agatha Christie who wrote detective novels, that would be, I don't know if it's possible to.
Absolutely, and you know that her influence on kind of modernism and a whole different.
Did we lose Kiera?
I think she may have lost her internet connection.
Give her a second to see if she jumps back on. She's coming back on via her phone. Are you back with us, Kiera?
Yeah, sorry about that. My computer has decided that it needs right now to install new things and has just shut itself down. I'm really sorry about that. So I'm on my phone now.
Thank you. I don't know if you saw the question in chat. We have time for probably one more question, or if you can see it now on your phone, are you able to see the sort of a question about the what you said regarding the fossil sisters sort of breaking away from gender norms? On the one hand, you could say that, of course, they felt free to do whatever they chose, regardless of gender expectations, because they had strong female characters in their lives. On the other hand, is it possible to say that perhaps gender norms in London in the 30s included more Sylvias, Theos, madams, and doctors than we may have realized?
Yeah, so actually it's not quite as radical as it now seems. Yeah, that is possible. But I think that even if that were the case, certainly within children's books, to have at the end of the text 3 characters who are looking forward to 3 distinct professions, with no mention made at all of, you know, any kind of relationship apart from to each other, that is still something that is really quite quite sort of progressive and radical and feminist, even for us now. Also, I mean, I suppose the number of people who would have known about those dancing mistresses and dancers in London in the 1930s would have been fairly limited, wouldn't it? So yeah, I think there is quite a, it is sort of, the ending in particular does have a great deal of power.
Thank you. And we do have just a couple more minutes. I was curious about what you said about Streatfeild and sort of her evolution from a performer to a writer and to an author, and how she took on sort of more agency and perhaps was more willing to or more able to sort of exceed some of the more restrictive expectations. I wonder if you could just elaborate on that for just a couple of minutes.
Yeah. So I think, she must have sort of learnt very, it seems like, she passes down to her character, the teaching characters, very much this kind of stagecraft, which is based on, doing as you're obliterating your personality. And I find this really interesting as well, because this is very much the approach to acting which Lewis Carroll takes. And so he tells Issa Bowman, for example, to forget Issa altogether. That the right way to act is to lose yourself completely in the part. And I think that there's something kind of interesting about kind of shifting from that sort of that quite kind of how to say it, sort of following cues of other people, or just doing as you're told, to then kind of taking up a position where you can kind of call the shots yourself, and put all of those words into other people's mouths, I suppose. Just seems like she's not quite, she wants to sort of have it both ways, and it just seems like, this is still kind of quite an early stage of her writing career. And so it just seems to me like she hasn't kind of fully made up her mind, maybe, but also that, maybe, she also does know that was what was expected of actors and actresses at that time.
Thank you. And there's one last question in the chat. Was it typical for theatrical productions of Alice to feature Alice's older sister?
It's a great question. I have absolutely no idea, but that would be one to go and look up. I think not. My hunch would be that they get rid of Alice's sister, but I'd very much like to go and find that out. That's a brilliant question.
All right, well, thank you very much. That was really fascinating, especially for somebody who has no knowledge of the book. It's really amazing. So thank you very much for joining us, and we're glad you're able to sort of jump back on and with those questions. So thanks for your masterful management of the technology limitations. So thank you.